Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
There was talk in the village that the local tiny store was profiting from just one son Stephen. The boy was arrogant, mean, and narcissistic. Anything that didn't suit him, he'd go straight to the bottle. People just nodded their heads, of course. Almost everyone in the village worked on his father's farm. But still, you gotta know some of the land. Even if your father is the breadwinner of the whole village. Christopher, I'm sorry, but your Stephen started another father-son tale of woe today. Story 1 from the beekeeper. What has my son done again? Top Brewster. After all, we've been working together for 5 years. Yes, I know my son well, don't worry. It's hard to surprise me anymore, the farm manager said. Anyway, he got into a fight with our guys again. He called them beggars. Anyway, they fixed his snout a little bit. But he didn't end up in the hospital. Don't be angry, he started it first, said the beekeeper even guiltily. He took off his big hat. However, he had his own in this case. After all, his son Sam contributed a lot, spoiled the face of the son of the chief. And how many times he told him, don't mess with the son of the man who feeds us. And so what can we take from today's youth? After all, Stephen tried to molest a girl on the bride. Except that Brewster decided to keep quiet about it. No need to spoil the mood of the boss even more. That we fool again to the bride of his son drunkenly molested. Christopher guessed. Brewster only sighed and spread his hands. It was a thing. It was discovered last year. At first, they'd started to get along. But when she got to know him better, being a straightforward girl, she sent him straight. Stephen pretended he didn't care. He even brought in some very clean city girls from time to time and bought himself an expensive car on credit. But all that didn't impress Eva in the slightest. She'd already decided on the flash drive. They weren't planning a wedding in the fall. Brewster was pleased with the choice of his son and thought that's how good the girl is. On the money chosen and do not give a damn. She chose a more reliable son, so he could be calm for Sam and his future family. But there was a case. Here's what I'm thinking, Christopher, maybe your boyfriend's wife. My Sam, once he realized the slang and the seriousness of it, he got smart. Yeah, I'd love to marry him. Brewster. Yeah, but what decent chick would marry him? And if he chooses a poor man like himself, I will not be able to get along with him, Christopher replied and sighed sorrowfully, the salutary thought that his son could be married. It had come to him more than once, but only those who wanted something in the queue did not stand. Even Camille, a divorced, rather promiscuous lady 7 years older than Stephen, and she left him last week. I don't need a man with more problems in his head than me. It's understandable. A man's got to be reliable. And if he's looking for adventure, he's no good to anybody. And that was the end of it with Brewster. Christopher was in a bad mood. His son was getting out of control. Why should I be surprised? I guess. A gray-haired, solidly built man of small stature. Because his son Stephen took after his mother Vanessa. She too was and remained a woman of great power and willfulness at the thought of his ex-wife. Christopher's cheeks flamed with anger. I can't think of anything like that. He conspired alcoholics from the neighboring village to physically eliminate him. Good that they were scared at the last moment and complained about the stupid woman. The local policeman Christopher had to get his ex-wife off his back, as they call it. Then Vanessa was treated and seen by a psychiatrist. Yes, only Christopher had a lot of experience in working with people, and he knew for sure that not everyone can be cured. His ex-wife cheated on him, and when he left after his youngest daughter came of age, he had to dump the children. And as it became known that he left not just nowhere, and married his ex, that's when she went crazy. She hated him with a fierce hatred, or maybe she never loved him. Maybe he was like a faithful dog that dared to run away from the kennel. Christopher's eyes flashed back to the last conversation he'd had with his ex-wife, whom they hadn't spoken to in 5 years. The ex-wife was wearing a green polka dot dress, similar to the one she had been wearing when they met. It was obvious that she had recently had her hair done and dyed. In fact, Christopher immediately smelled the odor that always emanated from Vanessa, which he said she had tidied herself up. Her lips were harshly compressed, as if it wasn't her ex who wanted to eliminate him, but he her. What was there to be surprised about, though? It was always like this. Vanessa had a way of shifting any blame to him. He decided he'd never speak first. After all, she was the one who needed to keep him from claiming part of the house in the divorce. Men knew that nothing else interested the woman with whom they had lived for almost 30 years. Alas, nothing else. That you're saying goodbye to me, you old fool. I'll never forgive him for betraying me. Rolling her eyes angrily out of orbits, a woman said, Christopher, if there is one thing he has learned during their marriage of half a lifetime, it is that with such people you cannot have a dialogue, because in their brains, as if there is a jumper. The slightest hint that they are guilty of something, and this information simply does not pass into the head, as if some invisible flap is closed. So the man kept silent and held back as best he could. He concentrated on his own breathing, started counting inhalations and exhalations. He couldn't be allowed to lose his temper. Vanessa, what's the big show? You're probably worried that I'm gonna take my share of the house. Well, I'm not gonna do that. You've got to have a place to live with the new love of your life, the ex-husband said. And he knew he was about to cause an uproar. Everyone in the village knew that Vanessa's new lover was a man 8 years younger than her. He stole all her savings and left in an unknown direction. So you shouldn't have mentioned this episode in the ex's life. It was petty of Christopher. But I couldn't help myself. A storm did break out. A torrent of insults rained down on the man. He felt like he'd been thrown into a waterfall. He couldn't make out his ex-wife's words because the blood was pounding in his temples. But Christopher didn't want to hear another word from her. So his blood pressure spiked just in time. And don't forget to sign a waiver for your share. Just don't think yourself very noble. You know very well you've ruined your whole life. Such words he parsed at the end. The man forced himself to turn on his hearing organs when he saw that Vanessa's swamp green eyes stopped jumping out of their orbits and throwing sparks. There was a sudden smell of some kind of freshness across the metal. Droplets bored into the windowsill. Rare ones at first, then more and more frequent. So he focused on the rain. Right now, he couldn't think about the fact that he had lived almost all his life with some inhuman woman who didn't put him and cheated on him, wanted to destroy him, hated him physically, and couldn't even find a word for him in her rich vocabulary. I'm sorry. It was hurtful. Of course, one could hardly believe her apology, but it would be nice nonetheless. Christopher stepped outside and put his flaming head into the salutary cool rain. It seemed to him that the nature around him sympathized with him and mourned the aimless years he had lived. He was giving his heart to the void, and the void gave nothing but hatred. What can I say? It'll pass. Here we go. 5 years ago, Christopher moved to another village, which was located almost 100 kilometers away from his former place of residence. He wanted a fresh start. He started his own farm, as his old friend David was by then also alone, as Christopher wanted to fulfill his dream. He had a lot of animals, an apiary, and a plot of land. But David was a city boy, and although he had some capital, he did not think of anything in farming. Then he remembered about his friend, with whom he served in the army, and offered him a third of the profit and some more salary if he would take the farm into his own hands. So it turned out that the former tractor driver, being over 50, suddenly became almost a capitalist. Of course I agree. David, you just let me build a house. Because my ex has ripped me off, and me like a sticky note. He said to his friend and asked him, then you won't regret that you offered me a third of the profit. Tall, thin David, sharp atheist, laughed. Oh, come on, Christopher. Why would I be sorry? Because I know about you that you're an honest and sensible man. Perhaps I haven't offered you enough. I don't want you to start thinking after a while that it's not enough for such a job. As for the house, this house has been taken into account. I heard about your situation from the locals. I bought a plot of land from a woman, and they've already built you a new house, David said. Christopher gasped. It's a whole new house. He thought only yesterday that the guys who built it were smart. The kitchen porch is made of brick, and the house is made of solid timber. It's just a song, not a new place. He could smell the fresh logs now. Wow, how am I going to pay you back? Christopher put his arm around David, and the latter lifted him off the ground. As they had done when they were still boys, and said at least 5 years. Promise me to keep an eye on the firm. That's all you'll owe. Trial of strength, friend. Oh, that's you. I can easily make promises. I've got nothing to do anyway. It's a long way from retirement. All right, tell me, what are we gonna do? Said Christopher. Well, we'll get there in time. You settle in a little, and then we'll discuss everything. For me will not rust, said the friend. So Christopher I got into some royal, in his opinion, conditions, and it all went well with him. Only his son was his pain. Because Stephen was not getting wise. He looked more and more like his mother. Stephen was as cocky as if he wasn't the son of a tractor driver. And the Shah of Persia was just as bad at getting along with people. Anything that didn't go his way, he didn't know how to swear. Anything he said was out of place. Christopher could not resent the workers of the company, that they did not respect him at all. Relationships with girls did not work out either. What was to expect if he almost from the first date began to shake the rights and load his beats? Is such a husband anyone needs? Christopher thought bitterly. Everything was aggravated by the fact that Stephen often went to his mother. And the mother, instead of putting him down, made him even more tense. You and I are clever, your father's a fool and has to put up with us. So Stephen came from her always agitated, looked like an angry turkey, always looking for someone to fight with. Lately, he's been hitting the bottle. But what can I do with this sucker? He bought an expensive car too. That's ridiculous. And now his credit. Even though his income is not bad, but the fool has chosen such a car that with this money you could buy a dozen good tractors. And if he gets involved in something more serious, if he gets involved with bad people, or if he kills someone in a fight, or if he gets killed, it's time to act decisively. But what to do? Christopher didn't know. I treated him in rehab for alcoholism. I talked to him and scared him and praised him. But all to no avail. The son doesn't take anything. His father's greatest fear was that his son had inherited some kind of madness from his mother. Maybe Stephen, schizoid or something. He tried to talk him into seeing a psychiatrist, but he only took offense and then didn't speak for months. That's how his mother Vanessa acted too. And then she thought it was a good thing that the feisty woman was trying to hurt him and not someone else. Christopher wasn't afraid for himself. He was lucky. The kind they say doesn't burn in fire or drown in water. As it happens, he'd had a streak of bad luck since childhood. He almost drowned in a well, but at the last moment he thought of a way to save himself and his friend. He put his feet against the walls and pounded his thighs furiously against the walls. They were made of stone, so I had to wrap a chain around my neck. After all, it was necessary to hold the younger comrade, who had already surrendered. Judging by the last pilot in his ears, Christopher still stood that deafening ringing zinc bucket against the stones. Comrade John, of course, still died later in the fire, but still lived to be 40 years old. They say he still had a family. Christopher remembered the bright red-haired John and brushed away a tear, and we still felt like he couldn't save him. And he had only dreamed it all. Sometimes he even dreamed of that well. There were other times. He almost drowned many times. He burned once, and one more time he was accidentally shot at by a visiting hunter who mistook him for animals. And it wasn't very good at Christopher's place. When he came to the village hospital, the head doctor, instead of greeting him, usually said, "Oh, so you're still alive, Christopher, hi." So his wife Vanessa almost killed him. Why did she love him? He carried her in his arms and gave her all his money and his stash, and didn't even have an affair. And lately, his heart stopped wiggling, and things were going smoothly. But Stephen was off the chain, and Christopher was ready to turn his misfortune on himself. If only his son would get better. Nor did he believe his own heart, which beat deceptively steady. It might not be for long. And if it happened to him, his son would be completely lost. So every trip to his mother's house, he gets frantic. What's he got to look forward to? Christopher decided to talk to his son again. Of course, there's nothing helpful here. But sometimes even the most unintelligent man unwittingly knows how to save himself. Maybe Stephen unwittingly spoke up. "What's up, son? How are you doing?" He asked his exact external copy tonight. 25 years younger. The son was also small in stature and solidly built. Interestingly, Stephen had all the stuffing of his mother, but he took after his father. Nature loves a joke like that. Christopher tried not to look at her son's painted face, which had a couple of finials, a broken cheekbone. There were a couple teeth missing, and front ones at that. But the father knew from experience that kicking his son was useless. So he reprimanded him. Didn't want to turn him against himself. He sighed with his nostrils the foreign odor of good coffee, which he disliked, brewed it for Stephen. The man liked to play the town baron. With his hands, he fumbled with the untreated surface of the table he himself had made at his leisure. In those long and tormented evenings, he tried to start life anew. After his wife's betrayal, it was comforting. He deliberately did not varnish the chair, and it was only in the hide. Sometimes it seemed to Christopher that this chair was his faithful friend, behind which he could make the best decisions. "Dad, you can see the villagers are jealous of me. They're fighting with me again. You know how hung up on the local folk are with my jealousy. And I don't think in patterns. And these ants, sacks, beggars crawling on their land. And can't see the light of day. I wish you'd let me go to town, Father. We've talked about this. Buy me an apartment and give me money for a year." And then I started my usual Stephen song. "Well, I'm also a creditor. What's an apartment? You should marry a good woman, even if it's just for the kids. And then we can think about your request. You have no education. You dropped out of college, and you're not used to working with your hands. You'll accumulate debts, and you'll be lost. At least in our village, all the alcoholics are in the open. At least in our village, all the alkies are in plain sight." Christopher realized that what he said about the alkies was wrong. His son drank himself to death and shut himself away. He didn't consider himself a drinker at all, though he was treated twice in the clinic, but everything was gone. The conversation now is unusually precise as to how his mother will behave, Christopher thought. "Well, that's what my mother told me, that you're an old bastard." The son moved on to insults. The right thing to do was to add a black eye to his face. That's what Christopher would have done, probably if some stranger had said it to him, a passerby. But he'd never laid a finger on his son in his life. Christopher felt sorry for his son. He should have left Vanessa sooner. She was a very bad mother. Once, when Christopher went to his sick mother in the neighboring village, Vanessa Stephen began to strangle with a wire from the iron, just because he wouldn't stay with her. Lucky then that his heart sensed something wrong and he came back early, or his son would be gone. Vanessa cheated a lot herself, and like all prodigal people, she was jealous. The rage was getting in the way of her son. Of course, it was his fault. He should have left and taken the child. Only he was afraid they wouldn't give him away in the divorce. After all, Vanessa didn't drink regularly. Adultery is no reason to take a child away from the mother. He knew his wife well. She'd go to hell to hurt Stephen if her husband had left her. So he waited and tried to take his son to work with him. Never left him alone with his mother. All these years lived in fear and torment. His heart was spared, and his wife felt perfectly well that for his son he trembles like an autumn leaf. She mocked him, threatened him. "You'll put up with it. You're not going anywhere." His wife blamed him most of all for his education. After all, he used to be a technologist. He could have made a career in the city, but his wife didn't want to go there, and he couldn't leave his son behind. So he stayed in the village and worked as a tractor driver. He accepted his evil fate. They say you want to know your fate. Look at your wife. And now he thought bitterly that even though he left Vanessa, you can't escape your fate. All her cabalist is arrogance, callousness, and even cruelty passed on to her son. His mother was right. Why are you marrying that Vanessa, son? Would you look at the women in her line? They went down a crooked road. Her grandmother was in jail for eating a man. Her aunt was a drunkard, and her mother had a child from someone else. You'll have children from her, and I'll have grandchildren. So you'll suffer. We only said it once. Christopher still regretted that he had done it his way. He was distracted from his thoughts by his son's voice. Anyway, that's the way Daddy either buys me an apartment or I'll smear this Sam. I'll go to jail, but he won't leave me. Who is he to make fun of me? The son summarized. Some words that Christopher had not heard. The father was now looking over his son's head at the wall, and squeezed the green-winged dung flies. I wanted to get up and swat it. The hostile smell of coffee made the blood in my temples pound at breakneck speed. Time stopped like leaving butter in a pot in the sun. Thrown instantly into the freezer, and now it can't be spread. It's layered in small chunks, deposited like ice. There was no more time, and I had to do something. My son could do something tonight. He didn't like this Eva false bride, but so caught up in his ego. Stephen took after his mother, would take revenge. If there was one thing the son had that was outstanding, it was pride, but it clung to him generously, apparently while he was still in the womb. Christopher had already made up his mind and heard his voice from outside, and he himself listened to his words with astonishment. After all, his brain had not yet fully realized the plan. Such things happen to him in extreme situations, usually against all odds. Such unwittingly verified words turned out to be the most correct. It was surprising to hear his own, confident and even friendly voice. As if there was no high-pressure coffee fly, frozen in the freezing butter of time. "All right, Stephen. I'll buy you an apartment, but here's the deal. You marry the woman I find for you. You'll live with her for a year, and she'll give you money for your needs. It's either that or nothing. If you don't like it, you can go back to your mother and live like her. You will be two horsemen without a head, who are rushing to their doom unknown where and unknown why." Christopher whispered tiredly. Now he was like an awakened lion who brings order to the truth and can easily and lazily beat the disobedient with his paw. There was no way the son could have guessed that his father was sick, afraid, tired, and on edge. "Where are you going to get me when an overseers from? From prison?" The son was surprised. Stephen's brain was thinking feverishly. What if his father really is seriously angry and just sends him back to his mother once and for all, and leaves him with his loan? No, Stephen wasn't that stupid. Realized he couldn't handle life without his father. At least not yet, though he hadn't given up hope of getting back on his feet. What he wanted most of all was someone to respect him. Because here everyone respects only his father, and his mother only pulls. She's using him for money through his father and turning him against him. Nobody needs him. He heard his father's answer through the frantic murmur of his thoughts, which were scurrying around like a lot of mice in a narrow hole. And that's none of your business. A contract is a contract. In the same month you will apply as confidently and with metal in his voice sounded father's voice on you, father. How can I put it? Surprised. Anyway, you're full of surprises. All right, let me my wife for a year for swanning. He's got a son in front of him. He always called him daddy when he was afraid he'd take drastic measures. His father rarely spoke harshly to him. But now Christopher really was determined. And keep in mind that you'll get the apartment and the bulk of the money after you fulfill your obligations in a year. Just in case, Christopher finally got the message across to his son. After all, if on the one that even a little acted like that, only if you repeat the same thing like a parrot many times for a long time, it in the head of the son will not hold. But it is possible to formalize everything legally. After all, normal, as a native man, Stephen to communicate in any way will not work. There was only one question where to get the bride of the overseers. After all, it was the son who suggested the idea. Then we must look for one. You wouldn't think of it today. Christopher had a 3-day rule for urgent decisions. If there was something he couldn't commit to, the first day he'd throw out all the options. The second tried something. The third made up his mind and had a decisive conversation. The trick was not to rush too much. For example, even if he really wanted to decide everything right on the first day, he restrained himself. If on the third day it rained and he only wanted to sleep and not see the light of day, he also overpowered himself and knew that that's how he wanted to cheat. The part of him that doesn't want to change anything on the first day. Among the options Christopher had thrown around was one that seemed appealing to him. 3 months ago, he was rewarding milkmaids among other farm workers. After all, people needed to be shown what to strive for. They were rewarded not only with certificates, but also with extra vacation days. Christopher used to think that just making sure that they did not work badly was not enough. But now he knew for sure that the greatest emphasis should be placed on showing the best. After all, people don't believe words. They are not fools. People believe deeds. So the best then was a young lame girl named Clara, not very pretty, a redhead with a limp, but her face shines with confidence and love for everything and everyone around her. Strong character. He put her in charge of a team of milkmaids for an experiment. The scandal stopped. People started working. Christopher got a bit of a kick in the nuts, though. The pushy girl demanded better bonus conditions. At first, he was angry with her. In just 6 months, she managed to bring the crew to unprecedented performance. Even his investor friend was surprised. Told him you had a young wonder behind that limp redhead. No one dares to make a peep. Everybody's working. Even the cows have become as if satisfied with life, and don't tell. I was angry with that girl at first. It turned out that she understands the right life, and she clearly has a talent for leadership. The young fool did not tell a friend of the investor of the firm in one person. So the first thing Christopher decided to find out about this girl to understand how to persuade her to look after his son for a year. Of course, he won't make her live with that little monster, his son in the same apartment. The marriage would be a sham. Still, she's a proud girl, and she won't do it just for the money. She might find it dubious. You have to know her weaknesses. Christopher invited the local gossip columnist Bragg over for tea. It was the media center of the village. Nothing got past the nosy old lady. Hey, Bragg, this one's got a new kind of cheese to sell. If you come into work as a taster, I'll charge you a round of any cheese you like. Everyone knows that you have the most refined taste in the village, said Christopher of the old lady with unusually bright as the sky blue eyes. Yes, squinted Christopher slyly, I was flattered. After all, she had worked for many years as a cook, and no local wedding had been held without her. And yet something was wrong. I mean, in the past, helping out as a taster. Christopher was kind of unnecessary. Oh, you're not a son, or are you thinking of getting married? She asked. He was suddenly as if hit under the breath. I didn't expect such sagacity from an old gossip. And she hadn't lost her sense of smell. Even the local precinct commander consulted Bragg when he couldn't deal with the locals. She never gave anyone away, but always helped to sort things out. So if the old lady's got him on his back now, you can trust her. She wouldn't give him away. From the street smelled freshness special that happens before a downpour, even fresher, painted clover, as if it began to exude its farewell fragrance more strongly. Standing out among the other grasses in the sky, something was beginning to grab, so far distant. But it's going to be a downpour soon enough. What are we standing here for? Bragg, it's coming down. Will you come in? Christopher asked the old lady. He didn't want to answer the question directly. There could be a lot of prying ears and eyes around. And Christopher did not want his son to be made even more local on his fool. That's what they called him. He felt sorry for Stephen. He had once been such a kind and reverent boy, he was all out. But his father had not forgotten how once, when he was very sick and went out into the corridor, he heard his son asking the Lord to take him instead of his father. The praying son was about 7 years old, no more. Stood skinny on his knees in front of the icon of his mom and tearfully asked God, "Only Dad, do not take me away. After all, my mom still says I'm no good." To tell you the truth, Christopher wanted to die then. It was the first time Vanessa started cheating openly. He wanted to go to sleep and never wake up. It happens even with strong men. You start dreaming, like, I will close my eyes and open them in the other world, that's all. You don't have to be responsible for anything. You don't have to pull anyone down. How deadly tired am I? Christopher remembered in detail that day, when just like that the same smell of clover rumbled in the sky. The first drops clattered on the metal, the windowsill where Vanessa was yelling at the neighbor. The true reason for his wife's anger was that she had laid it out. Christopher told her that it was not for nothing that he was going to town. But the formal reason was allegedly the fact that the branches, apple trees, neighbors' trees would drag down her vegetable garden and prevent cherry trees from growing. That's how that day stayed in his memory. Awe-inspiring words from his son that resounded to his heart's content. Shrieking about cherry trees and apple tree branches, kicking up from the clay the smell of clover. What drops more often? What drops more often from inside the head? Fatigue. It seemed to him then that eternity was listening to him and asking its not at all trivial question. Do you want to be or do you want not to be? Make up your mind. Then he suddenly cried. He decided to fight. Out of all the chaos, the sounds, the smells, the thoughts, was feeding his son. He could physically feel that his son's sharp knees had already caught from standing in front of the icon. It was as if he could sense his father's bad thoughts. A little more heart medicine. Be that as it may, he can't bear it, can't carry it on his shoulders. It is beyond human endeavor. But when Christopher cried quietly, as if waiting for a decision, the downpour came down with all its swift power. As if from somewhere in the sky, it wanted to bring important grace, love, support to the earth. The downpour silenced the screaming of his wife. Christopher decided that he would not give up, would fight no matter what, even if he lost. After all, it's important for a man to keep fighting. Otherwise, he'll resurrect the guilt like an old she-wolf. He will starve long and painfully, with the remnants of his once sharp teeth. Yes, he finally decided to live, even if he would always do everything wrong. And when he was gone, and when his tired heart gave a forbidding thump, he had an excuse. He became as many times as he fell. He didn't give up, he fought, tried to notice love and hate, chose patience, not revenge, and even if he lost, so what? It's not everyone's destiny to win. Then that's his destiny. Maybe it's not so evil. It just makes him stronger. It's still unclear why. But destiny works out one way or another. So the son has his own destiny. It's just that Stephen's development is delayed. He's not retarded, but he's a little slow on the uptake. No, not wisdom, not a drop. Then what's a father gonna do his best? That's what he was thinking under the sly squint of Bragg, who was now like one of those legendary washes that chooses these fates for a man and decides when to cut them. Let's go, I say something. They don't realize you need to talk to me one-on-one, Bragg. Brought him back to reality. And the mysterious lord of men's fates suddenly became the most banal old lady again, and only the celestial shadow in her eyes as something alien and reminded that she was not quite human, and the age-old wisdom. That's what all old people who have lived their lives with dignity become. If Christopher lived to be her age, he would be like that too. Christopher was suddenly desperate to hold a little grandson or granddaughter in his arms. He was already mentally holding a tiny hand in his big calloused hand and watching the trusting eyes of his future grandson or granddaughter. And for some reason he was in that dream. Carpathians. But Bragg's voice brought him back to earth. He remembered why he had called her. Bragg, there really is cheese. And we really have to choose what to produce for our own and what to sell to the city. Christopher started a complicated conversation. Well, let's try it. And you, don't get in the way. Tell me why you're here. Bragg made it clear right away that there was no need to pretend. Christopher started with her. He leisurely told about his plan, poured his pain for his son into the bottomless blue of Bragg's eyes, and that somewhere there dissolved, did not leave even a slave on the surface. The old woman had seen things, and they all passed. After all, everything passes sooner or later. Bragg kept tasting small pieces and said in a businesslike manner, "These are the cheeses to choose from. For urban gourmets, they're probably as good as Camembert. And these two are easier for ours. Our people like it to be universal, high quality, inexpensive, although it's good for the city too. People there don't all live in golden chambers. Most of them are impoverished, after all, and there is no home. How many people rent apartments or borrow money? They're poorer than us," a lot of people advised Bragg. Christopher was waiting for her to answer the big question. And as for Christopher, she's from our village, where you and your wife used to live. I'm sorry, everyone in our village knows everyone, said Bragg. How are you from our village? Why don't I know? Surprised Christopher. So her father John married you in town, and then his wife died. And he kind of only lived to 40, gave birth late. So her aunt put her to work here, the old lady said. Whoa, Bragg. My friend and his policeman almost drowned in the well. How come? Why is Bragg's last name different? And why didn't she tell me anything? After all, she knew that we were friends. Surprised Christopher. It's a complicated story. My father even had the misfortune to remarry at the age of 15. The girl ended up in the hands of her stepmother. To make a long story short, it's a soft bed. Yes, it was a rough bed. The stepmother cheated her, allegedly bought her share, but she got the apartment for nothing. And she dragged the girl to technical school and a dormitory when she wasn't even 18 yet. Why would you be so ceremonious after John's death? After all, you men don't know how you choose. It's all death. Don't think too hard. Bragg looked at Christopher with judgment, as if he had to answer now in a woman's court for the mistakes of all men at the same time. But he didn't bother to answer anything. Knew Bragg's life hadn't worked out. It wasn't just that her husband had pulled all the veins and money out of her and ended badly. Died in a drunken brawl. Left her with 3 kids in her arms, just a young girl. So he's not going to lose anything. He'll put up with a wise older woman for something he'll give her. Good advice. But they have a different last name. Why? Christopher asked. So she's married in the city, been around. That's why she's lame, so she's from the city. He's gone now. God forgive me. But sometimes God takes them in time. And that's the last name she has. And she has a child. She gave it to her sister. Yeah, she lives in the city. That's why she works so hard. It's obvious. Her daughter dreams of us, and you're the only one to live. I told you this so you'd treat her life humanely, so you wouldn't spoil it even more. We women are tormented by you as it is. I'm not talking about you, but about men in general and men like your son. A gift, to put it bluntly, a questionable gift. Straightforwardly made the old lady's point. Bragg, I know Stephen's a jerk myself. I'm gonna be blunt and say it right off the bat. So I want to propose a sham marriage, said Christopher. Well, then you just don't give her the money. Offer her a job as a manager in the city and an installment plan for housing. In general, so that she can live with her child in peace and without. She won't feel like a sellout. She's very proud to the point of nirvana, which doesn't surprise me when she's alive. The old woman sighed. I'll talk to her gently, but you don't tell anyone. What can I do for you? Christopher asked gently. After all, Bragg is not a lady either. From the looks of it, but she seems to be her own person. And a queen can rest next to such a one. You've got to know how to handle them. She carries herself as if Bragg were wise and majestic. You can't argue with that. Well, for example, we went to cover the roof. The old lady smiled. Christopher felt relieved. If she asked for something, it means that his plan is not so bad. And she did not think of him as some kind of today, which is eager to get rid of her son. He hurriedly began stacking the cheeses she had chosen and carrying the food. He was proud as a boy. The first lady sat kind of approving of his plan. Christopher, cheer up. Well, you're not hoping for anything a year from now. You're still young, Christopher. The blood's pumping and the optimism's flowing. I wish he'd get married himself. Nowadays, men are playing fiancés till they're old. It's your business not to have children. Well, I won't go on about it. She giggled indecently, pleased with herself Bragg. She was a good woman, but she couldn't miss a chance to go after their male kind. What was their fault? What was there to say about her father looking after her badly? And then he wanted to blame it on her when she obeyed the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Well, some people are still trying to fight women, blame them for everything, hiding behind their backs. To the young one, thank you. I mean, my 16th birthday's next year. I've had enough of my personal life. I've had enough. Christopher made a gesture with the inside of his palm to the KDK area. It's a serial passion. Then you don't want anything else. Bragg grinned and added in a kinder way. But it's not boring. Okay, hang in there, Christopher. If you need anything, I'll be in touch while you're on guard. She took another picture of her with her bright blue eyes and slowly swayed with a duck's gait and walked away. Well, the clean minister is Bragg. Christopher went home happily stomping right through the puddles. The rain ended, the sun looked out, and it felt good on his soul too. And so ended the day of option selection. And the next day he moved on to try and start implementing the plan. He asked Clark to come over. Christopher, something was not right, frowned at him. An anxious young red-headed woman. If it's wrong, you tell me right away what you can fix. It's all right. I want to offer you better terms, said Christopher. Come to my place for lunch. Respectfully, the man asked. Such workers were worth their weight in gold. He did not even want to leave the milkmaids without such a leader. But his son is still more important than the company and all the money in the world. I'll come in, but we're better, and everyone's happy. Christopher, what if people talk like that? Her gray eyes still looked wary, distrustful, like a visor. No one will not fire you, you dry, and there and aside, sighed the man. The conversation was going to be difficult, but there was nowhere to go, and so all his life. And who has it easy now? If it's easy for anyone, it only seems that you can take responsibility for life for a while. Then you will be thrown so many problems that you will learn to solve everything in time, and not to play hide and seek. After a few hours, he opened the cards, told about the problems with his son, and the fact that she is the daughter of his friend said, and that he knows about the daughter and can help, and just so. After all, she is his friend's daughter. Now the decision was up to her. The young woman limped around the office and gasped. Why not answer right away? She has been silent for 20 minutes and walks like a pendulum on an old clock to his grandmother, who is still working. She looked at him sternly. He was younger than her, so he did. She wanted to penetrate his intentions with her gaze in the ring. So you give me an interest-free loan from the company for 3 years and a manager's salary. You can work from home and only have to keep an eye on Stephen and give him the money. And every year you'll pay off 3 times the rent. So if I keep 3 years out of the country, his permanent supervisor, then the apartment will be mine, clarified Clara. That's right, confirmed Christopher. You don't have to, of course. After all, you're my friend's daughter. I can just help. Christopher began to play his tricks, and even himself became uncomfortable, but also some intonation of justification. Is that any way for a grown man to talk? Husband offered. You offered not to pull the cat by the tail. I don't need to give alms, Clara cut me off. With all due respect, Christopher, you don't owe me anything. Stephen, you only said a year. I'm booked for 3. Yeah, well, you've got a grip. All of a sudden, you're going to have a relationship with him. And no, he doesn't listen at all. Christopher honestly admitted. I'll think about it tomorrow. Can I go now? Asked her in a businesslike manner, as if poured on the heated head of Christopher a bucket of cold water. Yes, of course, I will wait for your decision, replied. Everything that was happening was stacked in his program of 3-day decision in difficult situations. He can't do anything else today, and he doesn't want to. What's this Clara like anyway? Clearly a talent. I even checked with him about the risks she'd take if Stephen shook up and ran right away from her. It was agreed that in this case he would still repay 1/3 of the unprecedented loan on the apartment and give her a job for the next few years. So there's a chance she'll take it. She's not like other young women. Maybe it'll work out. She's very smart. Brag, you're right, she's motivated. After all, what is more important, maybe, for every mother than to be with her child and make it happy as much as possible, but to nourish it with love? That's what's important to a normal mother, clarified an inner voice in Christopher's head. He remembered his ex-wife. That's someone who would not spare her son, just to spite her ex and satisfy her immediate desires and whims. And then there's no grass to grow. It's good that Clara is another such will tear for her loved ones and step on her own throat. It's a pity she'll only fake marry Stephen if she ever agrees. Dad, why are you so happy with your wife? Did you find me one yet? Christopher did not notice how his son quietly approached him. Soon you will know, Christopher replied and smiled contentedly gray, short-cropped mustache. I hope it is not red-haired, stern, limping still. Stephen asked cheekily. At least you need her in the city and an apartment. Who will I give away? She'll look after you, snapped his father, and he didn't expect it from himself. He wanted to protect this young woman, even though he knew almost nothing about her. And who does this shallow son think he is? If he agreed, he should kiss her, show off. Such as his son in the market on a good day give a dozen years, and then no one takes them. You can't get rid of them later. His father didn't say it out loud, but his son understood from his tone. The conversation is over. On the 3rd day, Christopher woke up earlier than usual. For the first time, the roosters were not crowing all over the village. Somehow it seemed that he had overslept. There was no price in either eye. What did you become? Shouldn't lie down either. That was another rule of Christopher's life. He left the house and reached the field of debauchery. The milky dawn mixed with the fog, and like a thick, sweet kissel lay over the village at least a spoonful. Mosquitoes were already scurrying in the air. One mosquito jumped on his cheek with an anesthetic and was already sucking blood. He felt it or swiped it. Didn't want to hurt anyone in the slightest today. Here was Vanessa too, injecting him with painkiller, talking about her feelings, which weren't there. There was him, her only love. The only fool who'd agreed to put up with it for years. There are people like mosquitoes, only worse. They pretend to be alive, to love. They talk about feelings in great detail, make up a personalized fairy tale with a plot that will please the victim. Then it turns out that it's all one big scam. Silk's heart does not blaze, does not ache. That's what the song seems to say. And yet Stephen is born. He's young. Maybe there's still a chance. We have to live, we have to fight. If things don't work out, at least things will get better for Clark. Maybe for the sake of this young red-headed, desperate woman, the thought of saving his son crossed his mind. Maybe you can't save him, and it was all to help this lady. It happens. Well, let it be. No one's gonna say that Christopher gave up. He didn't fight, and everything in the world seemed harmonious now. And the dawn, and the mosquito he swiped and didn't nail, which would have been easier. And even the crazy plan that Bragg had approved seemed appropriate too. Christopher, I kept thinking, how are we going to explain to the villagers why I'm marrying him? I mean, we haven't even really talked. I understand that it's important to you that everyone thinks your son is fine, said Clara. 12 o'clock after dawn. Well, you could say you're pregnant. After all, Stephen himself can't remember what or who he had with whom. You know that. So I'll tell him that he wanted you, I'm sorry. Then he'll understand why I chose you, and he'll listen to you. Don't look at him like he's an asshole. He's got a conscience, right? Does that fit? Asked Christopher. Let him. I don't care what people come up with. Just you, and tell them that I'm not going to live in the same apartment with him. I'm angry. Or what else can you think of? I'm agreeing to all this for the sake of my daughter. You know it yourself, the young woman said firmly. I know. Are you ready to replace yourself with someone to manage the milkmaid? And I'll talk to my son. You see, he will be like a silk, because you will give him the budget. Christopher grinned. Mustache. I do not know, money for such a nasty, spoiled man will not be enough. But being pregnant might help. I took a closer look at him. There's still something human about him. I'm not sure I can help. It's worth a try, Clara said. She spoke of Stephen as just another cow that had been bought in a bad way. We had to get her out, cure her, adapt her, and if we could, help her to be useful and live as a normal cow. Life would be better for her that way, otherwise she would go to meat. Christopher was not offended. He himself realized that his son did not have much time to turn into a human being. And if he does not start to develop and grow up, he will degenerate before you know it. He looked hopefully into the pale, milky white, determined face of the young woman. It was written on her face that she was ready to take the matter seriously. And then it was on. Stephen, as acute, agreed to marry, believed that Slagda got pregnant from him, accepted that she already has a 5-year-old daughter from her first marriage. After all, he cannot live forever with this red-haired, lame new. The main thing is to get away from her father, get money, and a house, freedom, to live his youth in the city, but not to bury himself alive. There's a lot of smart, poor people in the countryside who don't even consider him a human being. Bragg helped a lot. After a month, everyone believed that in fact Stephen often went to the lady for the tape hit So to Annoy. They corrected the wedding in the village and left. To the surprise of Christopher, even asked him for the first 6 months she and her son did not visit. She explained that it was for their own good. Vanessa did show up at the wedding. Demonstratively broadcast about purity, which to her deep regret, for many remains an abstract notion of anger mirrors on Clara. Tried to provoke the conflict, even yelled right at the wedding that she only wanted money from her son. But Slagda somehow agreed that the mother in the first 6 months of their joint life will not be invited. Stephen, however, agreed to this easily because the mother herself dreamed of moving to the city, to buy clothes, to look for young cavaliers, and on his money. And his father, and so the first year will be very limited to give him money through his red-haired lame warden fictitious wife. However, it will not be difficult to charm her and make her make concessions. Smaller ones at first, then bigger and bigger. Women are stupid. You tell them you're the only one. They'll melt like popsicles in the sun. Stephen considered himself very charismatic. He'd never seen himself from the outside. Otherwise, he would have realized that he already looked like a shabby cat from the dump. Some days he looked almost older than the father of Tuscany, not the first freshly used. That was the mildest thing that could be said of him. And the fact that he was trying to smile radiantly and showing teeth knocked out in a fight made him both ridiculous and pathetic. But Stephen didn't know any of that, so he was quite happy. He thought he was a prince on a white horse. He was going to become king and get rid of the hated picket of his fellow villagers who dared to judge him. He'll show them all that, son, don't forget. In a year, you'll have to support your child yourself, so you don't waste time in the city. Get a job right away. Of course, if you do everything as agreed, the apartment will be yours. But you have to pay utilities, buy food, clothes, support the child. In general, think ahead, said my father. Of course, he did not hope that his son would listen to him. But just in case he did, Christopher, do you really have a son got married? Why didn't you invite him to the wedding? His friend David asked him offensively, who owned most of the firm. There's a strange story about the horse. I don't really want to tell you yet. Anyway, it was more of a country wedding. It was very quick and modest. That's why I didn't call. Christopher replied. I saw your Stephen and his red-haired wife in the supermarket. They were choosing a crib and rattles. I really wanted to go over, but it was awkward. They were laughing, hugging. The girl with them was a little redhead who already calls her son daddy, and he was very affectionate with her. And the main thing is how the guy was replaced. With what loving eyes he looked at his wife and fell right into a sludge, David said. Another 20 minutes enthusiastically described the family idyll, which allegedly occurs in the son Christopher. The father couldn't believe it. How could this be? I mean, she's not pregnant. Why would she pick up a crib? Maybe they just saw David. I mean, Stephen knows he owns most of the firm, so he must have been quick on the uptake. Well, good for him. Christopher, a real spy, didn't see that coming. There's a reason he chose this smart young woman. And David, he said this, you know my son, he has 7 Fridays in a week. Maybe he needed a drink, so he pretended to be a good husband to please his wife. He's such a sneaky guy after his mother. Christopher sighed. Vanessa's ex-wife. He was, frankly, sick of it. Always demanding Stephen's address. She was always raring to go and visit the young ones to check the cleanliness of the apartment, to give advice and all that. Even started talking to him again. The insolent woman went so far as to insinuate to him that he could go back to his old love. What kind of love? The ex-wife must be confused. Probably forgot that she yelled at him when he found out that she wanted to hire hitmen to kill him over a piece of property. Vanessa screamed, "Screw you. If there is justice on earth, you will be gone this very year. And why? I only gave birth to your son. You slept with one son at the same time." He edited all this in his memory and removed retouches, especially evil and strong words. He tried to forget the hell that at that moment burst on the ground from the black eyes of the woman he once loved. It even seemed to him for a second that horns were sticking out of her salt black curls. And she does not knock with her heels, which she always wore only high heels. And even in the village she taps with her hooves. She lied about the general's son, of course. It was for a red word. She was having an affair with some visiting swindler who had neither a house nor a yard. Just a drunk, a fantasist. There was no general daddy there. Vanessa knew it herself. She broke up with him as soon as she found out he was no good. And yet it was his own fault. How naive was he then? He didn't see or hear anything around him. He also condemns his son for being stupid and superficial. Maybe the son has gone. You're not like your wife, but like him. It's a pity his mother didn't live longer. That's his fault too. After all, Vanessa was always being mean to her, even though her mother didn't say anything back, but only looked at her with silent reproach. Christopher guessed. He had cut his mother's life short. At least she had lived to see Stephen born. He remembered his mother's sigh of relief when she saw the trademark crooked little finger on her left hand. Everyone in their family had one. Said, "Oh, that's good. It's true. My grandson and your son." And she kissed Stephen on his rosy cheeks. Maybe it was a good thing she only lived to see his 800th birthday. He was a good boy then, and his mother didn't recognize what he's become now. Twisting and turning. I bet that Clara's got a lot on her nerves. Christopher even decided to end the torment of this young woman, his friend's daughter. Yes, he'll go and say that if his son is fed up with her, she can be free of him. There's no need for cajoling, hiding, pretending. She's had enough. Christopher remembered how whispered in the village evil tongues at their wedding, that she, they say, almost on purpose rich stupid. After all, who else would she be? Only Bragg knew about her daughter. So they say she got a job. She was tired of working, pretended to be a hard worker. That's when it all came out. She wanted the easy city life. And what did it come to? Even to this fool of a rich man's disgrace. You have to love money so much. You can give birth to one like that. Unless you're a retard like your father. That was the mildest thing they said about Clyde back then. It's about Christopher. It was all his fault. He'd arranged for her to look after Stephen. After all, he couldn't handle him himself. But was it fair to put that cross on the frail shoulders of a lame, red-haired milkmaid who had had enough of life? This conversation with David had awakened in him an agony of conscience. He imagined the agony of his Stephen. It was Clara for the sake of the child, as enduring his daily insult. I mean, he's got a nasty mouth. His son probably has to get him out of trouble. But he's hanging in there. He met David at the store, and here he was able to quickly calm Stephen down and make him play the right role. That's enough. You can't do that. It's not manly. It's not human. Taking advantage of his friend's daughter's plight and dumping his son on her. It's easier to manage a milkmaid and cows than one spoiled brat like that. He was determined to go to town within 3 days and tell Derry that she was free. No more dragging that asshole by the backbone. He would try to do something himself. But the next day, when he had already started to pack his traveling bag, the local boy who sometimes delivered letters from the post office suddenly arrived. If it was the yellow-striped ones that were supposed to be hand-delivered, Christopher danced a letter from the young ones. William told him. He did the best he could. Joy took out a 100 ruble and shoved it into the palm of the teenager's hand. Good for him. He's helping his mother out because she's raising him alone. "Will you come to work on our farm when you grow up?" he asked the teenager. Christopher tried to change the subject and hide his anxiety. It was growing. He fumbled with his thumb, the edges of the arch, and tried to delay as long as possible the moment when he would open the letter. Was he really too late? Why was the letter signed Stephen? What's wrong with the arch? I'll be there. How can Christopher not come? You probably don't want to open the letter in front of me. It's understandable. I'm a stranger. Forgive me for being intrusive. The guy waved goodbye and drove off. The man looked at him bitterly. William is a good boy. He's helping his mother out. He respects his father. Although, to tell the truth, he has nothing to respect his alcoholic father for. Somebody's lucky to have him. No, it can't be helped. Fate? Take it or leave it. I couldn't wait any longer. I opened the envelope. I tore it up brutally, savagely. My heart was pounding frantically. I sat down on a bench outside the house. Yes, he's getting old. He's afraid to read ordinary letters. This is what text he saw when a little breath, and crossed out the water from the rainwater barrel made a few Gladkov with a noise without use and without stopping. Cold water with difficulty, as if by itself overcame the resistance of the throat, and he calmed down a little. Daddy, don't be frightened. I know everything. I didn't get Clara pregnant. We didn't have anything. She told me everything about your arrangement. You see, I fell in love with her. I'm not kidding. I really did. We've decided to have a real wedding in the city. Mom, I don't want to invite her. You should come. Dad, now she's really pregnant with my baby. Can you imagine? I'm so happy to kiss you. Thank you. You just saved me. I've always loved you. We'll see you next week for the weekend. Hurry up, your wayward but loving son. That wasn't all. There was a note in Clark's handwriting at the end. Christopher, it's true. He's not kidding you. That's just the way it is. It started out as a necessity, but now we're a real family. Thank you. We're waiting. Thank you. At the bottom, the child's hand drew another flower and a sun. Apparently, Clara's little daughter also decided to write something to him, but decided to limit herself to a drawing. My mind was a mess. How could it be? Is it really true? The valise was already packed. He had given all the necessary orders. All that remained was to leave. He decided to drive, to calm down, to think about everything. Try to believe it. When Christopher drove, it always calmed him down. He didn't even notice how he traveled 200 kilometers. Good thing he left early. He missed most of the traffic. He drove up to a familiar house where, as he had assumed 6 months ago, his son could start an even worse life than he had led before. But it turned out that the city had brought Stephen happiness. The son lived on the first floor on the signal. His son didn't leave him his cell phone. They agreed that he wouldn't bother them for 6 months. Clara insisted on it. In 10 minutes, the whole family was having tea. As he entered the apartment, smelled happiness and fresh baked goods. He realized he wasn't fooled. You can't fake that. Happiness was here. A little family paradise. Even though he'd have a son, he hadn't suffered in vain. A tear rolled down. "Why are you crying?" asked the little 5-year-old redhead. "For joy," honestly answered Christopher. "Let me give you a hug. You'll be my grandpa too." "Or just my new baby brother's grandfather?" asked the girl. "Of course, I will be your grandfather too," said sincerely and thanked for the flower and sunshine she drew in the letter. "And so you realized that this is my drawing?" asked the girl. "Yes, after all, I am not as a living you talent," replied the newly minted grandfather. "This is just the beginning. I will be a great artist," seriously promised the girl. "Since you want it, it will be," replied Christopher. Soon he learned the whole story. It turned out that at first Clara and Stephen met each other, and really, in the bayonets communicated with each other with great difficulty. You see, Stephen hated me terribly and called me nothing but jailer. She laughed out loud when she told the story. "Well, you did behave like that," Stephen smiled. It was evident that he had already made a subservient man in the best sense of the word, and he enjoyed it. But then we started going out with him in the evenings to talk. And the first thing that surprised me was that he really wanted to be a father. "After all, your son thought I was pregnant because of him," she said. Then I felt uncomfortable and decided to tell it like it was. He tried to stop me from working, and he got a job himself, trained as a cabinet maker, and in a month. "So you're carving wood again?" surprised Christopher. At one time, his son really showed great zeal for this work, but then abandoned. And how he exactly repeated the ancient carvings, even in wood himself made shutters, having seen the pattern in a museum, where Christopher took him. "Yeah, Dad, but you're the one who told me to think about providing for my family." "So I did," Stephen marveled. He had already forgotten to what state of hopelessness he had driven his father and everyone around him. With his behavior, said it. "But don't take offense. You know you turned into something when you lived in the village, so I don't really trust you to listen to me. You stopped doing that a long time ago." "The last time I heard it was when I was a kid." With resentment, Christopher said. He was a little jealous. "Here's the re-education. Re-educate." And then Clara came along and his son changed his life radically. I guess he's not a good father after all. So we should not envy Clara's success in raising a future husband, but be happy for the young. "Dad, I'm sorry, I really was a fool. I just didn't have time to even think about life. I resented you. You're the Honorable Christopher, and what am I? Some kind of free appendage to you. So I was mad at you for raising a fool. I don't drink anymore, by the way, and I quit smoking. Because you're my wife is more strict. She even kept me away from bullies." Stephen looked at Clark and laughed. "Bullies? Aren't you a bully yourself?" Christopher smiled and asked Clara. "Clara, tell me the story. I'm getting curious. I guess I'm getting old." "When I got the letter, I didn't even believe it was true. I still don't believe it." He smiled and spread his hands. That's all I expected from life, but not happiness. It was like this. Zoran slyly looked at Stephen. Should I tell your father everything as it is? Asked me. What to hide worse, my father will not think worse of me, he told her and nodded approvingly. All their own and gathered together, you can say that without a bill. Anyway, this was before Stephen decided to get a job. And that was the first time I was impressed. We arranged to meet him for lunch. We were supposed to go to the store together and get something for the baby. I wasn't expecting your grandson then like I am now. But your son thought I was. And when I was approaching the place where we agreed to meet, I noticed that some thugs were shaking him by the chest, the woman said. Yes, I had a drink with them the night before. At their expense, I promised to give them money, otherwise you forgot. So it's your own fault. But Clara didn't know about it. She thought it was just some dangerous strangers pestering me, Stephen clarified. Yeah, confirmed Clara. Well, my dad's even a friend. He taught me self-defense from the age of 6, told me to be ready for anything. Often told Christopher how you saved him from the well thanks to your good physical training. And he was just hanging on to you like macaroni, according to my dad. Is that true? Asked Clara and smiled warmly. Well, your daddy was very small. Smaller than your Lisa is now. And I was about 10 years old. So who should have been the one to save the day but me? It would have been weird if a 4-year-old was pulling out a healthy 10-year-old forehead. Christopher laughed. We got scared now as he remembered the bucket whipping around and banging frantically on the stone walls of the well. And the only one who heard them was his mother. She must have sensed something wrong in her heart and came running in from work, though she usually always had lunch there and for herself, and left lunch for him under a set plate. Christopher remembered looking up and seeing his mother's pale face. It smelled of damp and his mom's cheap perfume. White roses. It was a smell he still associated with salvation. He even made a flower bed with white roses on his farm, though they didn't do flowers. But they were my mother's favorite flowers. My mother then quietly and even kind of pitifully said, Samichka, you little chain, take it off, or it will hit you inadvertently. We'll pull you out now. You'll hold on a little longer. Only then, after his mother's words, he felt that his neck was already bent from the chain, and he was about to suffocate. Only then he realized that it was not necessary to jerk frantically from the last strength, and to knock, knock again and knock again, drumming a tin bucket against the walls of the well. The bucket was the tongue of the bell, and he himself was its eternal slave. Then the men came down on a rope, and the last thing he remembers. For some reason he thought one of them might be saved. His legs went numb. He couldn't hold on inside any longer. He was only holding on for the stove. That little boy saved him then. And he was gone when John hanging pale macaroni was finally tied up with a rope. He said, Mama, I'm sorry. I can't go on. Tired. Very tired. I love you so much, Mommy. I tried. I tried so hard to grow up. With these words, he suddenly began to faint and saw that he was going to fail. The men managed to grab him. And if he'd fallen in, I don't think they would have. Fished out of the cold water, which like a bloodthirsty monster licked his bare heels. Shoe he threw off to hold on tenaciously with his heels, like a monkey. The cold water of the well was like a monster that had already tasted them with the stove and wanted to swallow them. But the beast's plan was thwarted at the last moment by the pale face at her mother's side. The salvation of the white rose. The smell of her perfume. And back at the calf again. The raining of the bucket, the stone walls. Darkness. And when he woke up again, his mother's pale face, frightened and happy at the same time. Now he told this story for the first time. He had never told anyone in such detail before, not even his mom, not even himself. And for some reason she wanted to tell him. Forty suddenly realized that the pale face of the red-haired milkmaid was also salvation. He held his son in his arms until the last moment. He tried to save him and couldn't. But fate sent him this woman, and she somehow easily and playfully did what seemed impossible. Unbelievable. Now he's going to be a grandfather. The unhealthy passion in his relationship with his wife was like that well, the water in which his feet lay and longed to swallow. And if he had given in a little earlier, his son would have been unable to hold back. But he was different now. This was no grown-up spoiled child, but a man, a father, and a husband. What happiness! And why had he thought then that only either he or John could survive? No one should be given away. Business always has to keep fighting. And now he caught himself thinking that he doesn't want to live like he used to live to save his son and die. No, now he wants to live more than ever. Clara, I'm sorry I interrupted you in your story about your father. Didn't you tell about the bullies you saved my Stephen from? Christopher blushed at this awkward situation, talking like an old parrot about things that have long since become true. Interrupting the young. What is it, Christopher? Because I really wanted to hear about Daddy again. I miss him. His gift. What about the bullies? I swooped in out of the blue and didn't even get a chance to get into a fight. Just little things. One of them got his hands behind his back. I helped the other one down. It just kind of happened. And then the cops that somebody called came running. They thought I'd been attacked, sympathized. It was kind of embarrassing. I was the one who ran into them, laughed Clara. That's the whole story. That's it for you? Not for me. That's when I got it in my head that you joined in. I thought, how am I living with pregnant women sticking up for me? How low can I go? You can call me poor, you can call me anything you want. But I never hid behind a woman's back. I was so ashamed that I decided I'd had enough. I'd never be ashamed of myself again. Remembering you, I think I'll raise my son anyway. I had the example of a good father in front of me. In short, that's when I fell in love once and for all, Stephen said. And I later said even when you, after you found out I wasn't pregnant, still continued to treat me and Lisa well. And you said you'd never give us away to your dad. And I'll be honest with you. When David told me he saw you smiling and kissing in the store, I thought you were putting on a show for him. We didn't see Uncle David. And when he did, he was surprised. Dad detailed that David had painted their family idol for him a month ago. So all day long they shared the most important things, and they felt like a family. Clara talked about the upcoming wedding, which they would celebrate only with their family. I have something else to tell you. We need to be alone. It's man talk, Stephen told him. When Clara and Lisa went off to do some business of their own. What happened? Christopher was scared. Would it all go up in smoke? Did it seem that his son was a scoundrel, making up the whole thing to deceive Clara so that she would be nicer to him? Dad, I really love Clara. That's not what I wanted to talk about. It was as if the son had read it, he thought. Christopher was touched. It had happened a long time ago, when Stephen was very young. What's wrong, son? He asked Stephen, softly. Do you remember you once took offense at me and said you were schizophrenic and that you took after your mother? Did you? You see, because my child, he could take after me. I'm really afraid of that. Just tell me the truth. Don't feel sorry for me, my son asked. He was more serious than ever. It's a strange thing. I couldn't grow up. Suddenly, it just happened overnight. Son, this is a very hard question, but I'm going to tell you the truth. Your mother's not exactly normal. Remember when I used to take her to the vacation home sometimes? That sort of thing. Did you still stay with your grandmother when you were little? Of course I remember. So it's true. I'm crazy, went to my mother, asked her. It's more complicated than that. You see, your mother was different once. When I met her, she was just a regular nice young girl. Maybe a little nervous. But then I left to join the army and she was young, stupid, got drunk with her girlfriends, went to a club. On the way back, they were dragged into a car by some scumbags. She's been crazy ever since. It's my fault. I mean, she told me to think of something, not to leave. I knew her mother wasn't looking after her at all and was busy with her personal life. Anyway, when I got there, she changed drastically. She became cynical. I felt I had to protect her. Since then, she's had weeks when she's not herself. In a way, we're already a hater. So her family's not very well off. That's the thing, Dad sighed. Well, at least it's not hereditary schizophrenia. My mom was the one who acted really weird sometimes. So I thought all this time that I was doomed. But I didn't dare ask you, sighed Stephen. You should have asked me, son, because you and I are family. "There's no one closer to me than you," said Christopher. "Thank you, Dad, for all your patience. I remember you watched over me like a kite. After Mom attacked me and wanted to strangle me," said Stephen. "So you noticed everything." Dad was surprised. "Of course, I was always afraid of Mom, and most of all I was afraid that you wouldn't stand for it and leave the family. After all, John's father left him after his mother cheated on him, so he was afraid after every scandal that you'd leave," Stephen said. "What do you mean? I would never leave you. You saved me, as my friend John saved me in the well by your mere presence. If he had not been so small and frightened and weak, I would never have lasted so long," my father confessed. And after a moment's silence, he added, "Now you don't have to be weak at all, son. I now want to live to bring up my grandchildren. I am no longer afraid of anything." The son hugged his father. A week later, a modest celebration took place. Or rather, it was originally planned as such. But then, in confidence, the guests arrived. Bragg was the first to arrive and said she just happened to be passing by. "A friend's granddaughter works at this cafe." It was clear that wasn't true. Christopher understood. It didn't seem to him that the mysterious letter had been hidden and then taped up again. After all, William was a Bragg decoy, and the invitation with the address was offered there. Then David arrived. How did he know of the wedding? No one knew, but the suspicion was that Morse had chattered to Bragg too. After all, he had often asked her for advice about the firm, considered her a guru, always treated her with honor and respect. Along with David, of course, couldn't help but burst in with a whole Oriental tale, limousine orchestra password. A puffy envelope of cash, some fancy presenter, and a show of entertainers he'd hired. Moreover, he had rented a sanatorium nearby for a week, and there he had already paid for accommodation, buffet, bridal suite, and everything in the world, even some super-duper photo shoot by a photographer from a very famous magazine. David was followed by a whole delegation from the village. They all wanted to celebrate the second wedding of Christopher and his son. After all, when else will there be such a celebration? Even a tracking link came. By that time, they were already married and were expecting a baby boy. Everyone was surprised that at such a big term, she could hardly see her belly because according to their calculations, she was about to give birth. "Well, it's our breed." Smiling, the bride answered the curious. Vanessa was not left out. For the sake of such an occasion, she found a young groom somewhere and kissed him defiantly in front of Christopher. And he just fluttered his arms. Whatever the child wants, as long as it's not violent. "Vanessa, have you been saving your paycheck? I hired this guy somewhere in the city to spite you," Bragg whispered. In Christopher's home village, she had a trusted face snitch and a friend. "All right. Bragg, just don't tell anyone else. Let her have her triumph," said Christopher good-naturedly. Another man would have thrown her out with a broom and a broom. "You tolerate everything and allow everything," said Bragg reproachfully. "Well, what can I do? I'm her main husband in life, for all intents and purposes. So I guess it's my fault she's like this. It's a good brother," Christopher smiled. "Okay, the cafe has a metal detector, security. So it's makeup, you won't get into any trouble," Bragg said. "I'll go. I'll tell her she looks younger. After all, it's the only thing she listens to closely." Good idea. The workers approved of Christopher. On this day, he didn't mind his wife getting her share of happiness too. The main thing was that no one should be harmed by her experiencing it. The groom took the floor. All eyes turned to him. "My dear wife, my dear daughter. Lisa, my dear future son. On this important day, I promise that I take for you all full and final responsibility as my father once took for me." Stephen saw my mom whisper angrily, and added, "Of course, a huge thank you to my beloved mom. You probably all thought that young curly-haired woman in the red dress was my sister. It wasn't." Vanessa melted and like a peacock proudly performed an embroidered and gold-threaded neckline. She beckoned to her hired young suitor, and he gave her a subservient hug. He glanced at his watch. Apparently his lease was about to expire. Stephen winked at Clara and Lisa. Let mommy be happy too. And then he put his daughter on Slaga's shoulders. And so all evening he danced with the young wife and the future son in her womb. The villagers marveled at him. And hardly a limp. That's what love does.